A lot of people wish there was a silver bullet that we could apply in the context of osteoarthritis, where it was either a pill or an injection, and that ameliorated all of your pain. Unfortunately, at this point in time, pain and the management of that is still a large unmet need in the context of osteoarthritis. It's an incredibly complicated area. There's lots of reasons why people get pain, how they manifest in terms of their pain, and much of the management options that are available for the management of pain are not optimal, whether we think about that as the anti-inflammatory, paracetamol, or opioids in particular. So there's lots and lots of room for improvement in managing pain and in the development of agents to help in that regard. And that's really the focus of today's conversation, is to try to better understand how we can improve modalities for managing pain and process for the development of those agents in that context. And we're really privileged to have a couple of my industry colleagues to talk about this particular topic. So Sarah Kennedy is a PhD-trained pharmaceutical industry medical affairs professional, and Stefan Ivanavicius is a medical affairs professional, both of whom are working within the pharmaceutical industry, and they're bringing their insights to this particular question today. I think it's important to note that both Stefan and Sarah are speaking based on their individual experience and perspectives and not on behalf of Grunenthal or Ivanavicius or their employers. Hello, Sarah and Stefan. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Hi, David. Thank you for inviting us on.
Great to have you both here, and really looking forward to the insights that you're going to provide in what I hope will be a really engaging and informative episode for the listening audience. But before we get into that, and Sarah, I'll probably just start with you if that's okay. Can you just share with the listeners a little bit more about your background and what a typical day looks like?
I work in the pharmaceutical industry. I am trained as a PhD. I did bench science, but actually before that, as an undergrad, I worked with athletes at the university level. And I think my journey has been nice in that it's been able to be a nice blending in terms of the basic and clinical science throughout the course of my career. In terms of a typical day, I'm not sure I really have one. I think every day is a little bit different, trying to make sure that I can communicate well with all the different people on my team, both here in the US and across the globe, but also making sure I'm staying on top of the science that matters in terms of everything we were trying to accomplish.
Wonderful. Now, I know you live in a beautiful part of the world, but when you're not doing your day job, what do you like to do?
Try to make as much use of this beautiful part of the world as possible. So I do live in Colorado, where we have wonderful mountains. So depending on the season, we're out hiking or biking. I do have 2 teenage boys and a dog. So there's some watching of teenage sporting events, but they're also quite active kids. So they're often skiing, etc., and trying to make sure that we keep them in one piece as they go about their adventures keeps us quite busy.
Yeah, I'm sure it's fully engaging. And if you had to describe yourself in 5 words, what would they be?
Yeah, I crowdsourced a little bit of this one, but I would lead with mother. I think that that's a very important part of my identity. Similar to a lot of your guests, I would describe myself as curious. I like to learn about nearly everything I encounter most days. I like to think of myself as adventurous, so getting out into those mountains in as many different ways as possible. And then to kind of close off with 2 Ps, persistent, which I prefer to stubborn, and passionate.
Yeah, it's always good to convey words that are more favorable in that regard, aren't they? But if you had to choose a preferable method of exploring the mountains in Colorado, what's your preferred method?
So in summer, probably mountain biking, and in winter, obviously skiing.
Yeah. And do you cross-country ski as well?
I do, cross country and downhill.
Oh, gosh, very envious right now. But anyway, we'll get back to that at some other point in time. Stefan, if I can kick to you, can you share with the listeners a little bit more about your background and what a typical day looks like?
I can indeed. So I'm based in the northwest of the UK, near Manchester, and I live with my wife and 2 boys. I've got Max, who's a 10-year-old, and Jensen, who's an 8-year-old. Like Sarah, I work in the pharma industry, and I work within the medical affairs division. And for anybody that's not familiar with what medical affairs is in the pharmaceutical industry, I will break it down very simplistically into We cover evidence generation in the form of supporting clinical research and real-world evidence, evidence communication in the form of publications, presentations, and educational initiatives. And probably my favorite part is building strategic partnerships through collaborative initiatives with various different societies and research organizations. I guess very early on, I completed a PhD at the University of Bath, which was fully funded by a pharma company at that point, and also in collaboration with the Royal National Hospital for Rheumatic Diseases. And I investigated then the innervation of the knee joint, specifically focusing in on the nerves that are responsible for pain transmission and the different subtypes of nerves and their kind of neurochemical profiles, and also their potential as targets for osteoarthritis. And now I use that background in my day-to-day job to try and advance osteoarthritis treatment development. Like Sarah, I don't really know what a typical day looks like. We travel quite a lot in our occupation. If we're traveling, it could mean a breakfast meeting somewhere in the world, followed by lectures at a congress or meetings with various different individuals, and then finish the day with dinner with colleagues and collaborators. If I'm at home, it's a very different story, where I'm generally looking after the kids, waking them up, sitting down in back-to-back meetings on Zoom or Teams, and then trying to persuade them to do their homework at the end of the day.
Now, I'm not your wife, but how much of your time do you spend away from home? Just out of interest.
It really does vary. In a given month, it can be 0, or it can be as much as 50 or 60%, depending on what's happening at that particular time.
Yeah, yeah. And Stefan, you started alluding to it with mention of the family, but when you're not doing your day job, what do you like to do?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. We love holidays and family fun. And at the moment, we tend to do more of the kind of beach type holidays. I'm very jealous of the Colorado mountains. We'd definitely be doing more of that if they were nearby. My kids at the moment aren't massively interested in cultural trips, but I think that'll change as they start to get a little bit older. So they're more into adventuring and exploring, and what we tend to do is rent a villa in Greece somewhere and hire a speedboat and go up and down the coast and drop anchor wherever we like and explore caves and coves and catch little sea creatures, which they seem to love. Also, in addition to this, I coach minis and juniors rugby at our local club where both of the boys play. I used to play myself for over 20 years. Now I'm a little bit too old and creaky, so I tend to get my rugby fix from coaching and from attending the occasional international.
Wonderful. I didn't know you were a rugby fan. We'll have to chat about that at some point as well. I'm a massive All Black supporter, having been born in New Zealand and lived some formative years there. Let's not get into that just now. But if you had to describe yourself in 5 words, what would they be?
I also did a bit of crowdsourcing for this, and I asked my family. My wife's suggestions weren't entirely what I was after. In fact, I think some of them were probably on the verge of slanderous. So I opted with the boys' versions instead. And my favorite of all of their suggestions, I've been selective here, the first of which was erudite. I'll come back to that in a moment. Extroverted, although they actually said sociable. I've gone with expressive, although they said you talk a lot and wave your hands while you're doing it. And the final 2 were the ones that I really liked and probably meant the most, which were considerate and loving, which I think are all pretty good reflections of me. But I was particularly impressed with erudite. I had no idea that Max even knew that word. But as I dove a little bit deeper and learned more, I realized that it was his word of the week at school. So I think he was just trying to shoehorn it in at any given opportunity. But I genuinely think, similar to what Sarah said, that it's an accurate descriptor, because I've always had this thirst for knowledge, which I think is ultimately why I did a PhD and why I now work in a field where you continuously have to acquire huge volumes of information and digest it and interpret it and communicate it as effectively as you can.
Wonderful. It's always good to have glowing reports coming back from your kids, but I was, to be honest, much more interested in what your wife had to say, but we'll talk about that at some other point as well. Now, based upon the content of today, obviously it's a hugely important area. The pain in the context of osteoarthritis is still a very large unmet need, and many of the management modalities that are currently available for treating this are either only modestly effective or have a side effect profile which is not optimal. But can you just give me a little bit more background on why pain is still an unmet need for osteoarthritis, Stefan?
Absolutely. I really like this question. I think there's several different ways to address it, and I'll tee us off by simply saying that pain is an extremely complex phenomenon, particularly in the context of osteoarthritis, and certainly more so than I think most people give credit for. There are different types of pain, there's different origins of pain, and the ways in which patients and almost all people experience pain is influenced by a host of various different factors, including psychosocial factors in addition to the biological ones. And I'll touch upon a few of these. But regarding the different pain types, we mentioned off air a moment ago that Sarah and I both listened to the podcast. And I think one of my favorite ones recently was the one with Professor Nidhi Sofat. And I think she described some of these features fantastically, particularly in relation to the different pain types. We're aware of at least 4 different types of pain. These include nociceptive pain, which relates to the pain that's due to non-neural damage, inflammatory pain, which occurs in the presence of pro-inflammatory mediators, neuropathic pain, which results from direct damage of neural tissue, and the new kid on the block is nociplastic pain. And this is really used to describe the changes in normal nociception, but in the absence of any definite or potential threatened tissue damage. So with osteoarthritis, there can be any variation of these pain types. One may predominate over others, or it could be a complex mixture of more than one. There's also questions around the structural origins of pain in osteoarthritis. We, I guess, now consider OA as being a disease of the whole joint, and we know that almost all structures within the joint are innervated with pain nerves. And again, we often refer to these as C fibers and A delta fibers. And these structures include synovium, periosteum, subchondral bone, and even cartilage. And ordinarily in a healthy joint, the cartilage would be aneural and avascular. However, as structural pathology starts to occur and progress, then cracks appear and sprouting of new nerves and vasculature start to infiltrate that space. And these nerves have the capacity to become highly sensitized and really drive the pain. So it's entirely plausible, I think, that one type of pain could originate from one joint structure while another might originate from elsewhere in the joint, manifesting differently. And so current analgesics and treatment regimens may not be able to fully cater for this. We know that different pharmacological agents that are used to manage pain in osteoarthritis work better on different pain types. And then just to throw further complexity into this, we know that the way that patients experience pain and different types of pain is influenced by countless different factors. And again, I know it's something that you've discussed on this podcast previously, but the biopsychosocial model acknowledges that, I guess, pain is far from being a simple sensory experience. It's massively convoluted and a subjective phenomenon that's influenced and exacerbated by a whole range of different dimensions and factors like anxiety, depression, stress, beliefs around pain, and then the more kind of social side around access to healthcare and financial stability. So it's a huge kind of cauldron of complexity.
Yeah, wonderful response. And I think really conveys most of the topics around that complexity that you were really digging into there. And thank you for the shout out to Nidhi Sofat's episode on the podcast. And I guess just a quick shout out to Anne-Marie Malfay's episode on the origins of pain in the context of osteoarthritis as well, for people who want to dig a little bit further into the complexity of that area. And I think that complexity in part leads to some of the challenges in addressing pain management and developing new therapies to target that. So with that in mind, what's the problem with the way we currently manage this using pharmacologic agents? Why don't they work as well as they could, and what are the problems with them?
Yeah, so I think that without directly tying a specific source of pain to a specific patient, there's always going to be some amount of trial and error and just guesswork because we have not personalized that aspect of the management of NEOA. I think that when we think about just how heterogeneous all the different sources of pain, all the different ways people will express their pain and how they will experience their pain, but we have these really blunt tools. So we know that we can manage pain generally with something like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which may not be appropriate for all patients and may not be appropriate long-term. So we're kind of using these blunt instruments to manage a chronic and complicated condition.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I guess just elaborate a little bit further on what Sarah's saying. The first modality of management from a pharmacologic perspective in the context of osteoarthritis care that's recommended by most guidelines, as Sarah said, is the anti-inflammatory group. And at best, they probably tend to have modest effects, and they have a range of side effect profiles, particularly in the population of people that we treat. Issues with the gut and ulcers and potential compromise in the liver and kidney and so on. You may have intentionally done so, but did you want to make any comments about other agents which are commonly used there, particularly opioids, paracetamol?
Yeah, and I think that more and more the guidelines have been moving away from using the other agents that are available. So paracetamol, or acetaminophen as we call it here, is because of the side effect profile, really in the small effect size. Basically, it doesn't usually really have an effect that is seen as clinically meaningful. So what the patient will benefit from that is usually not worth the risks of the side effect profile. Opioids, again, I think overall as a society, we are trying to move away from opioids in terms of pain management, just because of the myriad of side effects that can be associated with them. With that being said, there are still some people for whom the benefits will outweigh the risks, just because people do need to have some control of their pain to manage the other aspects of their life. I think moving beyond what can be taken orally, and NSAIDs can be oral, or you can put them directly on your joints. Some people do move on to injections, and these, again, I think can have a place in terms of the short-term management. For example, corticosteroids can really help people say they have a holiday coming up and they really would like to be able to get out and travel. I think that there's definitely some short-term pain management that really can help people get out and have that short-term function. But when we're considering the chronic nature of osteoarthritis, it's really not a good long-term solution.
Wonderful. You touched upon this, and whether either of you want to speak to it, obviously this pain is incredibly complex. We know osteoarthritis is incredibly heterogeneous in terms of its presenting characteristics. There's been a lot of innovation with regards development of new techniques for understanding that pain and new knowledge that's emerged with regards mechanisms as to why people get to pain. In the interest of, I guess, trying to personalize care, are we at a point now where we can start thinking about the application of some of that new knowledge in a more nuanced way?
So I think from a research perspective, we're really making great strides in terms of a better understanding of, for example, we said that these many different structures of the knee joint could be contributing to knee pain, but how well we can use those tools clinically, I'm not sure that we're quite there yet. There are some things we can look at. So a really swollen joint is something that you might be able to tell yourself, your physician might be able to tell upon exam, in which case you have signs of active inflammation, in which case treating them with an anti-inflammatory drug might make a lot of sense. Some of the other more chronic aspects, for example, if people think that bone marrow lesions, for example, which is something that would only be seen on an MRI, which is not usually something that's indicated for routine clinical practice. I think it's great to really help us better understand the disease. And as we're developing new therapies, the better we can understand it, the more targeted therapies we can develop. But I'm not sure that we have yet good personalized markers. I think looking at other biomarkers is something that was really our hope for the condition, and really the hope for personalized medicine for most conditions. And it's something that we're just not there yet for OA.
Yeah. And we may get back into that a little bit later on, but I guess in the interest of particularly picking your brains, given both of you work in the pharmaceutical industry, about how drugs are developed, can you just tell us a little bit about how long it takes to bring a drug to market and what some of the hurdles that you may need to step through or over are?
Absolutely, and I'll pick up on this one. I don't think it'll be any great surprise to anybody listening that drug development can take many years. In the interest of simplicity, I can break down the process into two sections, and those will be preclinical and clinical development. So clinical development tends to refer to the research that's conducted in humans, whereas preclinical drug development includes the research prior to human trials, and it can include in vitro and cell-based assays, animal models, computer modeling, etc. So I'll pick up on the preclinical aspects, and then I can hand over to Sarah to discuss the clinical stages. So I think perhaps the earliest point in the whole process is the discovery piece. where a druggable target is identified. And it's kind of at this stage that bioinformatics teams will screen huge volumes of data to identify potential targets. And when I'm saying targets, I mean these targets could be specific receptors and ion channels, biochemicals, gene sequences. There's a whole range of different targets that would potentially be druggable. And you really want to see, are they elevated or are they decreased in disease conditions versus in healthy conditions? Once you've got a target that you've identified, then it needs to be validated. And so we have target identification and target validation, or TITV, which it tends to get abbreviated to. And so by this, we're talking validation means, can this be pharmacologically manipulated? And if it can, will it achieve the desired outcome that you're looking for? And in the context of pain, does it reduce pain? And so we can test this in vivo, in vitro. I guess once we've got some confidence in this TITV stage, we can start to develop compounds that will modulate the target, whatever that modulation might be, to increase it, decrease it, block it, activate it. And then if necessary, we can further optimize these compounds through slight adjustments to the chemical structure or the molecular makeup. And by doing this, generally we optimize a range of different parameters, and these include pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and safety. Again, I realize that some people might not know what some of these terms mean. So I guess put simply, pharmacodynamics refers to its mechanism of action. Does it block receptor X or inhibit enzyme Y? And if we optimize the structure, then perhaps it will bind even more selectively or with greater affinity or with greater potency. And also we have to test, is it efficacious in animal models? Is it doing what we want it to do? And then when we talk about pharmacokinetics or PK, what we're asking is, what does the body do to this compound? And the PK parameters include things like absorption. How does the body absorb this particular compound? Distribution, where does it go once it has been administered, however it is administered? The metabolism, how does your body break this drug down? And then excretion, how does your body get rid of the drug once it's been taken in? And so one of the key features here is, does the compound actually even reach the target that you're intending it to get to? So in early development, there are many, many very potent compounds, but when they're taken orally or if they enter the systemic circulation, get rapidly metabolized before they ever even reach their intended target, meaning that there is insufficient availability for that compound to have its desired pharmacodynamic effect and elicit any kind of efficacy. So similarly to PK/PD, there's preclinical toxicity screening that is performed at various intervals throughout the preclinical and then throughout the clinical stages, because there's no point having a really good PK/PD profile if your compound has too many undesirable side effects or that it won't be tolerated. So I can give a specific example from my past where we've done some of this in my postdoc experience. We had some compounds that had brilliant pharmacodynamic properties for several different osteoarthritis pain targets, but they had suboptimal pharmacokinetics or really poor safety profiles when they were administered orally or went systemically. So we explored different methods of reformulating them, and we changed the route of administration. So we eventually ended up binding some of these compounds that were originally intended for oral delivery, and we bound them to microspheres and nanospheres for intra-articular injection. We're going back 20 years here, by the way. Things have evolved since this point. But by injecting these reformulated compounds directly into the knee joint, the pharmacodynamic effects were maintained and the efficacy looked really good in animal models. But the systemic toxicity that we saw orally had been eliminated. And we also avoided then some of the pharmacokinetic challenges, particularly around extensive metabolism. But the whole preclinical process can take quite some time, almost as long as it's taken me to explain it. So I'll hand over to Sarah.
Just before Sarah kicks in there, though, can you give us a sort of average length of time, if there is one?
Well, depending on where you look or how fortunate you are, it can be anywhere between 3 and 6 years. And whilst you're doing this, you can rule out thousands of different compounds by tweaking and manipulating the different structures. So yeah, it takes some time.
Superb. All right. The baton's in your hand now, Sarah, so I'll let you run with it.
I'll take it and go. So once there has been enough reason to believe in a compound from all the preclinical studies, we'll start to test it in humans. And the first stage of testing something in humans is usually called a phase 1 trial. And basically to have approval to put a compound into a human, you have to go through some regulatory steps where you convince, say, for example, in the US, the FDA, that you have a reason to believe that it's worth studying this in humans. When you're doing a phase 1 study, and these are the first in human studies, you usually test it in just a small number of people. So in probably the tens is what you would be talking about. And really what you're looking for is to confirm that it is safe enough to put this compound into people and probably to put it into more people. If that first phase 1 study looks safe enough, then what you'll do is move to phase 2. Phase 2 is usually called the proof of concept stage. And what you want to do in phase 2 is say that the drug or compound will do what you are hoping it will do. So for example, if we're talking about a pain drug for knee osteoarthritis, what you want to see, and again, you're looking in reasonably small numbers, usually in the tens, maybe up to small 100, that you can get a signal of an effect. So if we're talking about knee OA, you want to see that there would be a decrease in pain if you're looking for a pain drug in knee OA. If you have that proof of concept established from phase 2, then you will move on to phase 3. And phase 3 is really what your confirmatory studies are. And again, for the US, usually you'll want to have 2 studies that both show that in an even larger number of patients that you can reliably demonstrate that your drug is safe and effective for its intended purpose. From that point, you would file for the drug to become more broadly available.
Wonderful. And again, just that question in terms of the average length of time from the commencement of phase 1 through to the regulatory approval, hopefully.
Yeah, so depending on the compound, you're looking probably at another 5 to 10 years after the preclinical studies have been completed. There was just a paper that came out in JAMA last month that was updating what they expect for cost. And unfortunately, pain trials tend to be some of the least reliable and the highest failure rates, as well as the most expensive. So overall, when you're talking about drug development, the cost for the trials themselves will average maybe about $300 million. If you average in the total cost of programs, considering that the majority of them will fail, you're looking at, for pain drugs in particular, you're nearing $2 billion. So it's not a very high success rate. You're looking at, if you start with thousands of test compounds to get to a single approved drug.
Fascinating insights of an incredibly challenging area. But can you provide a little bit more about what insights or challenges there may be specifically in the osteoarthritis space with bringing a new product, hopefully, to market?
So again, we know that there's a lot of heterogeneity of disease. We don't at this point have a good biomarker to match the right patient with the right drug. I think we need to have some improvements in terms of the tools we're using to both measure outcomes. We have these pretty blunt instruments where we're asking people, how do you feel about, say, your knee arthritis, when they might have pain in both knees and their hips and their back, and it's really hard to isolate what that pain in that specific joint might be. I think, Stefan, you wanted to add a few comments as well?
I think we're getting there, David, and I think we're learning lessons from everything that's come before. And I think the first time I heard it was at Aussie last year, but the reference to the osteoarthritis graveyard, and I've heard it again a few times since. So I've given it some thought, and I'm trying to look at this OA graveyard as less of a graveyard now. And I don't think it's necessarily where things get dead and buried. It's more of a scrap heap or a reclamation yard where I think certain pieces possibly be salvaged, whether it's the compound itself or different aspects from the trial. Because I think with every trial that's failed, I think there's certainly pieces of this that we can now use to try and optimize new trial designs, or the trial designs that we're working on. So I think when you talk about how are we going to crack this space, I think we touched on it a little bit earlier on as well, is around patient selection. For all clinical trials, there's inclusion and exclusion criteria so that you can make sure you've got this representative cohort. But again, I think moving forward, clinical trials in pain for osteoarthritis, it might be worth starting to go down the route of stratifying based on particular types of either pain or the different OA types, whether they're endotypes or phenotypes. What Sarah was saying around different outcome measures, not using these blunt tools, I think that's one way of really trying to push this ahead. And maybe if we can start to move away from traditional pain scales that might not fully capture the multidimensional nature of OA pain. So I think criteria like ORSI, OMERACT, and the more that they can start to gather momentum, I think this will probably start to take this space further forward.
Superb. Yeah, I mean, I like the way you're trying to reframe the graveyard, because I think it's probably more like stepping stones for learning. And so every trial that has failed, potentially we learn something from that hopefully we can reposition products moving forward. Now, obviously, we cast the existing pharmacologic landscape for pain management in the context of osteoarthritis in a pretty disparaging lens earlier on. But I'm just wondering, if we are to develop new therapies and innovations in pain management, how can that improve care for people that has osteoarthritis? What impact can this make?
I'll pick this up. In terms of innovations and really what feeds into my own personal bias, I tend to think that, I guess, the emergence of more targeted treatments might move us in the right direction. I guess there's a number of different molecules that are in development at the moment that really target specific kind of neuronal mechanisms, and these may offer a way of reducing more than one of the different pain types that we mentioned earlier on. The origin and the type of pain in osteoarthritis may vary, but the pain is still transmitted via the same neurons within a particular innervation territory, not innovation. So I think selective interruption of the pain signaling at a neuronal level may offer something new. I think the anti-NGFs almost bridged this gap, but I think some of the molecules that are currently in development might just make it over that line. And then again, just to come back to the thread that we've been alluding to at intervals throughout the discussion today, is around targeting of either specific patients or of specific OA types or pain types. I genuinely think the more that we understand and we start to unravel these phenotypes and endotypes, I think these are probably going to start to guide the direction. We're not quite there yet, I don't think. We're starting to get there, or certainly we're talking about getting there. But I think a focus on theratypes and really starting to manage it that way is going to potentially offer new innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all recognize that the disease is incredibly heterogeneous, and there's a strong need for all of us to apply tools to help stratify the population a lot better. I think the challenge at the moment is those tools are not optimal, and so we've got a little bit of work to do there. But I think it's an exciting space, and hopefully will facilitate personalizing care a little bit more. Now, any other comments that either of you want to make before we move on to the closing question?
I think just tagging on to that last piece about what's coming next, I think that your comment on stepping stones is just perfect. And one of the things that I think really is different about the OA research community is how collaborative it is. And I really do think that in terms of advancing therapies in this space, everyone is moving towards a common goal of bringing more treatment possibilities to patients. So I think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of what we can do here.
Yeah, it's an incredibly exciting time, and there's a huge amount of potential and a lot of advance and innovation happening. Obviously can't speak for both of you, but we're really optimistic that something good will happen in this space very, very soon. Now, in closing, and please feel free, both of you, to chime in here one at a time, is there one piece of knowledge, advice, wisdom that you think would be valuable for people living with osteoarthritis to hear?
Yeah, I think that there's reason for hope would be the main thing to hold on to. I think that the science is improving, the treatments are improving, and hopefully the tools to measure those changes are improving. And I think with all of those things in mind, there's really, as you just said, reason to believe that people will have more tools at their disposal, hopefully sooner than later.
Wonderful. Stefan, any closing thoughts?
I'd just like to let anybody that's listening that has osteoarthritis know that if it wasn't apparent before, hopefully it is now, but there's a worldwide army of people specializing in this field, from clinical practice, from academia, from the pharma industry to patient advocacy groups. And we're all working collaboratively with a common goal. And that common goal is to learn more and to better manage this disease. So I would say, please don't suffer in silence. Join an advocacy group and share your experience, because I think the more awareness that we can garner and the more attention we'll get, then hopefully we'll get to that goal sooner.
Yeah, wonderfully positive ways to close. Thank you both so much for spending a little bit of time chatting to our listeners, sharing your incredibly valuable insights, and Again, huge kudos to both of you for the work that you're doing, and really looking forward to the advances that hopefully will come to pass very soon.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. Probably goes without saying that at present time, for many people who have osteoarthritis, their pain is not being adequately managed, either with lifestyle and behavioral modalities or with medication pharmacologic modalities at this point in time. There are lots of limitations with regards to our existing therapies, and hopefully we'll be able to improve upon those with novel therapies as we continue to discover and innovate within this field. Now, the process of drug development is complicated, and Stefan spoke about the preclinical side and Sarah spoke about the clinical sides of drug development. That takes a long time. It's expensive. There's lots of failures in there, and there's lots of hurdles that they have to jump through in order to get to a product that's approved. And I think a lot of the knowledge that we're gaining in the context of osteoarthritis brings hope, both with regards to our understanding of the heterogeneity of disease, ways that we can target pain a little bit better, and the fact that we know a little bit more about where pain may be emerging from. And so it's in that light that, I'm really optimistic, and I think Sarah and Stefan as well, about the promise of new agents coming forward in the management of pain for osteoarthritis. And it's with that hope that I'm going to leave you today. I hope this episode was interesting and informative for you. Thank you for your continued support of the Joint Action podcast. And between now and when we next have an opportunity to interact, please do take care of yourself.
Thanks for listening to Joint Action with David Hunter. If you like our show and want to know more, visit www.jointaction.info. If you have any questions, you can email us at hello@jointaction.info and follow us on Twitter @jointactionorg. This podcast was hosted by David Hunter, edited by Vicky Duong, music produced by Jordan Hunter. The information posted on this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. Anyone seeking medical advice should consult a health professional.